Welcome to Christ the Center, your weekly conversation of Reformed theology. This is episode 867 by my count. My name is Camden Busey, and I'm in Libertyville, Illinois. As usual, really excited today. I'm geared up to be speaking about the Westminster Assembly a little bit, to speak about the Westminster Divines, and to speak most specifically about John Arrowsmith and a new book we have that he has written that has now been translated, titled in this edition, Plans for Holy War. To do that, we have with us the translator of this work, who was just on 3 weeks ago. This is just less than 3 weeks ago in real time, but 3 weeks ago in episode time, David. We have Dr. David Noe, who serves as pastor of Reformation Orthodox Presbyterian Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Of course, he's an excellent Latinist and Greek scholar, has done much language work, and does quite a bit of language instruction on his various websites, one of them being latinperdiem.com, and you can check out mossmethod.com as well. Welcome, David. It's great to see you again.
Thanks, Camden. Good to be here.
I love it. Love it. And I'm glad to have you back. We had such fun last time, and I encourage people who haven't listened to or watched the episode to check out our conversation with David on the Meter Center at Calvin University. He recently hosted a little workshop there with some various scholars from all over the world coming to read Latin together. It was a really fun conversation. We got a lot of good feedback about that, and hope people can catch up with it if you haven't. And if you're interested in these kinds of things, please follow up with David. All the links will be in the episode description here as well, and get your learning on. It'll be good for you, good for your heart, good for your soul, good for your mind. We also have a great friend of ours, very happy to welcome the editor and the person who's done some biographical introduction to the subject at hand today, Dr. Chad Van Dixhoorn, who is professor of church history and theology at Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. And all three of us, I should have mentioned, are OPC ministers, so we got a triumvirate today. Welcome, Chad. It's great to see you. Glad to have you this morning.
Great to be here, Camden.
Yes, we're very excited to have Chad on. Of course, people will know Chad from such things as the minutes and papers of the Westminster Assembly. I've got a copy of that on my shelf that was donated to us. I'm very happy, and I was consulting that for preparation for this episode, so thank you for your work there, Chad, and putting that together. I love that set. Chad's also written God's Ambassadors, Confessing the Faith. He's written a wonderful book on marriage with his lovely wife, Emily. We've had several interviews on these books in the past, so check out our episode archive to catch up with Dr. Van Dixhoorn. Well, guys, I'm really excited today, and before we get into the book, speaking about John Arrowsmith's Plans for Holy War, let me mention just two brief things. First off, our conference is coming up September 28th, 2024, in Grayslake, Illinois, which is not too far from O'Hare Airport in Chicagoland. It's easy to get here. We would love to have you come as we're discussing the ordinary means of grace and the Great Commission. We'll have 5 speakers, all on Saturday, September 28th, and we're encouraging people to register now. So take a look at our website, reformedforum.org/conference for more information. I've been speaking about that for a couple weeks now, but we're encouraging everyone to get registered. Our pre-conference event is filling up, and the main conference is still available, but we only have about 100 spots. It's a wonderful conference, lots of time to interact with other people and with the speakers, so register today. We also have a webinar coming up with Dr. Lane Tipton. I should have had the dates in front of me. I believe almost certain it's August 15th. And Dr. Tipton will be speaking about the immutable person of the Son, particularly looking at some Christological passages in Hebrews. So if you're interested in a scholarly presentation on the subject, we're going to have a webinar or a live presentation. You can register for that online. Information on that will be on our website as well at reformedforum.org/events. That event is free, and it will be live, although you do need to register in order to get in. It's a Zoom webinar, so register on our website. It's entirely for free. We'd love to have you, and you'll be able to ask any questions in the question engine system the Zoom has, and Dr. Tipton, no doubt, would love to interact with you and speak about the subject. So those are 2 events coming up. We're looking forward to them, and I'm excited to meet many of you online, so to speak, and to meet you in person if you're able to come up here in September. Thank you very much. All right, brothers, now on to today's business. We have the book before us, Plans for Holy War by John Arrowsmith. It is published by Reformation Heritage Books. It's in the particular series here, the Westminster Assembly Project, various writings on the Westminster Divines. We've interviewed other scholars on this particular series before. Of course, it's the series is edited by John Bauer, David Noe, and Chad Van Dixhoorn. All three have been on Christ the Center to speak about the different volumes. But here we're speaking about Arrowsmith's Plans for Holy War. Now, I got to get the joke out of the way. We're not talking about Steven Tyler or Joe Perry. We're talking about John Arrowsmith, Arrowsmith. And he was a Westminster divine, although he left early. Perhaps that'll come up in he had a good reason. He was really upset. And a very interesting figure, historically speaking. But a name that maybe a lot of people just in the pew haven't heard. So perhaps I'll start with Chad, if you might just introduce Arrowsmith biographically, because you wrote about a 70-page introduction in this book, which I loved reading. How did you first come across John Arrowsmith, and might you provide a little thumbnail biographical sketch about the man so that we can orient ourselves historically?
Yeah, so Arrowsmith wrote a little book called A Chain of Principles, and it's the beginning of what was supposed to be, I think, a 5 or 6 volume systematic study of different doctrinal topics. I think that was maybe the second rare book that I purchased. So I became familiar with him in the late 1990s. And then of course he keeps appearing every time I study the Westminster Assembly. He was a key figure, perhaps the most important figure in the construction of the Westminster Confession of Faith, much admired by his peers. So when David contacted me and said he'd like to do some translation work, translating John Arrowsmith was quickly at the forefront of our agenda. So that's how we got it. That's how I got to know. That's my biography with John Smith. And you want to know a little bit more about him too.
Sure.
So probably grew up in a godly family on the northeast coast of England, northeast. He went to Cambridge to study. Was hired as a fellow. Worked at taught and studied at St. Catherine's. One of the great things about being a fellow back then is you were just really paid to do your own study. That was your job. And then you could also do sort of tutoring on the side, which of course he did. So he did that for a while, but you're not allowed to be married. You were not allowed to be married as a Cambridge fellow or Oxford fellow. And so when he finally desired to be married, he moved to a pastoral position. He had a curacy at King's Lynn. And then, but he was the curate of a chapel, which sounds like a low position if you kind of understand your Anglican terminology, at a small place. This chapel is one of the large churches of England. It's just massive and beautiful. And he had a large congregation. And that's where he spent many years, got married, had some children, lost his wife, lost the children, and eventually was called to the Westminster Assembly, where he played a major part. Partway through, he was called to serve as the master of St. John's College, Cambridge. And then he began kind of commuting back and forth between Westminster and Cambridge. Sometimes they'll say, we can't work on this right now. We're waiting for John Arrowsmith to come back into town. Also, while a Westminster Divine, he was serving as a pastor of a London church. So preaching regularly, at least twice a Sunday, full-time during the week at the Westminster Assembly. And I don't think he was sort of repreaching old sermons. In fact, he was choosing some of the more theologically rich books of the Bible to preach through, John and Hebrews, and so on. He was very theologically minded. His sermons are very theologically minded. Two, I think, sermon series boy, I'm trying to remember, David, what 2 books of the Bible. I think maybe his Hebrew sermons were lost entirely, and then another book as well. The printer, if you look at the register of the printers in London, a printer said, this is a volume by John Arrowsmith I'm going to print. Here's another volume by John Arrowsmith I'm going to print, and then a bunch of others. 2 of those volumes just never got printed. So that's too bad. That would be after his death. So I could ramble too long, but we can tell you in a minute why this book is so extraordinary. That brings us back to his biography. But in an outline, he's at Cambridge, then in ministry, then at the Assembly, in ministry, and at Cambridge, and then spends the rest of his life as a Cambridge master, head of a college, and a brief stint as the vice chancellor of the university, and then a longer stint as the Regius Professor of Divinity.
Wow. David, how were you introduced to Arrowsmith, John Arrowsmith, that is? How were you?
Right.
If you want to talk about the more contemporary rock band, that's fine.
That's
too.
all right. I know a little bit about that, but it's not worth mentioning.
Yeah.
So the year was 2014, and we were in Grand Rapids for the General Assembly of the OPC. And I used to be in the Presbytery of the Mid-Atlantic as a ruling elder. And so I was hanging around with those guys. And at the time, Chad was in that presbytery, maybe still is, I don't know. And so we got seated next to each other. And I had been an admirer of his work from afar. And I was trying to hitch my wagon to his star. So we were seated next to each other. And I said, Dr. Van Dixhoorn, I sent you an email a few years ago, and I didn't get a response. And he said, what? Oh, no, that can't be. And he checked his archive and said, oh, yes, I didn't respond. So sorry. So I've told that story before, but, Orosius was an individual who was a friend of Augustine's, and Orosius was kind of a pest. And to get him out of his hair, Augustine said, Orosius, why don't you write a universal history? Because that should take some time. So when I approached Chad, he said, yes, we should do something together. And then he gave me an alphabetical list of works that had not been translated. And there were some 70 or 80. And I think that was partially meant to deter me, I think. The first one on the list was John Arrowsmith. So I went home, and as rapidly as I could, I translated about 25 pages because I wanted to make a good impression. And I sent it to him, and he was, wasn't very good by my current standards, but it was good enough at the time to start a partnership. And so then we got some nice funding from Calvin College at the time, from RTS, some other places. We had a mutual friend in the late Howard Griffin, and worked on it off and on until really 2019. Because I had other things to finish, Calvin, Beza, Perkins, and then finished it really between 19 and 20. And only just to add a little bit to what Chad said, I think he was born in 1602, and I hope Chad tells the story, not Chad, but Arrowsmith. I hope he tells the story of Arrowsmith's untimely death, which I think was 1659, and this work was published just a couple years before his death.
57.
And of course, it was a really fascinating thing to contribute to.
Yeah, that's something I think worth mentioning right now at the moment is about his illness. This really puts this work into context in a different way. And without having this biographical introduction, which you've even Chad's titled, at least the printer, the publisher has, John Arrowsmith, A Theological Life. Without having that context, you're missing something of the book. And it's not necessarily the kind of book that you would expect someone who is pretty much literally on their deathbed for them to write. Chad, I'm wondering if you might explain some of that context and about his circumstances and why this book is really quite remarkable, but biographically, but also theologically.
So John Arrowsmith was very ill in the last few years of his life, went so far as to see a doctor, always a scary proposition in the early modern period. No one could help him. Near the end of his life, he was supposed to, for the last time, address the university as the Regius Professor of Divinity. He was too sick to do so. David's translated the comments of his dear friend John Lightfoot, who's right behind me here, who was grieving what they thought was his final illness. So he was supposed to give a series of lectures to the university, which are in this book. He couldn't. I think he could manage to give, the Latin's a little unclear, but I think he managed to give the lectures that are at the front of the book. But then he also had wanted to give a series of talks to his college. Unable to do that, he wrote this book instead. And I think what's so extraordinary about this is, if you're a dying man and you've got multiple volumes that just need to be edited to be ready for the press, you'd think that's what you'd do. And one of those volumes is currently in St. John's Library. It's in really great shape. It wouldn't have taken that much work to get it ready for the press. That's not what he does. He decides to take on a new project. And then there's different kinds of new projects. You could do something simple, like do a commentary on the Westminster Confession of Faith, where like the topics are nicely set out for you and you just need to talk about them, or a commentary on the Bible. He had a bunch of those in progress. No, instead he takes a theme that he believes is running through the Bible, that he doesn't think anyone's really kind of put together in a proper way, and he writes this sustained argument in beautiful Latin, with hundreds and hundreds of different authors being mentioned, with largely accurate citations, in a prose. I mean, David is not in love with the prose of the Latin prose of all Puritans. This is gorgeous stuff, and it's an amazing book. I think it is the most interesting book I've ever read by a Puritan. Wow. And he does this as he's dying. It's really amazing at any point in life, but to do this as a dying man, such a work of scholarship, a work with so many literary merits and theological merits, is really quite extraordinary.
David, would you speak to that? Speak about the Latin. How is this distinguished from other works of the time? I mean, how might this even compare to Calvin and others who typically have good style as well?
Sure. And please feel free to jump in here, Chad, if I get any of the historical details off a little bit. So I spent quite a bit of time in the 16th century. Men like Calvin, Beza, and Vermigli, on the whole, had a superior training in Latinity, I would say. And as time went on, it became more and more difficult to imitate that sort of training. So men like John Owen and Rutherford and so forth, they write good Latin in terms of the accuracy of the construction and so forth, but it doesn't seem natural compared to the men of the previous generations who were thinking in Latin. They weren't thinking in their native mother tongue and then putting it into Latin. Arrowsmith is an exception, at least in part, and his style is highly Senecan, so it's based on the Roman philosopher, Stoic author Seneca. But the work itself has, I believe, more than 600 separate references, and they're pretty evenly divided between classical authors, patristic authors, Renaissance authors, and then contemporaries. So he quotes Luther at length. He quotes Calvin and Beza and Melanchthon, but there's just an enormous amount of classical quotations as well, from Homer to Lucan to Cicero, and really on and on. And that made it very delightful because he's to translate, because he's using these authors skillfully. They're not simply an adornment to an otherwise dry style. They are, I think, very surgically employed to make a point. So virtually every page there is some poetry. Wow. And this was a challenge because, of course, I wanted to do it well. And I'll be eager to hear what the critics say if anyone reads it. But of how to get these, these classical poetic references into English in a way that's sufferable. So Chad described it at one time as we were working on this like this. He said, it's as though we're brought into Arrowsmith's library and he's sitting at his desk and he's going page by page through everything he's ever read or been exposed to, and he's finding a way to employ it in this particular essay, for the specific purpose that Chad already described.
Yeah.
So that made it very interesting.
That's tremendous. And why he was intentionally seeking an international audience, wasn't he? I believe that was indicated, in the biography. And I mean, for people who might not know, was it very common typically to write in Latin to begin with? Like anyone doing theological works would be writing in Latin anyway. But I'm wondering what he thought of this work and its use even as he was writing it. Chad?
So he's pretty proud of the fact that he's an Englishman, and that comes through, and might not have sat well with his foreign audience. So he's playing to an English audience in the way he talks his country, local theologians, or I should say English theologians, and so on. But yes, this is definitely a work for an international audience. If you are capable of writing in Latin, you want your best work in Latin in the 16th and 17th century, so that you can reach a broader audience. And Arrowsmith is no exception. And indeed, there was later a reprint for that broader audience that so appreciated the first edition of the work.
Sure.
So. That comes through very clearly in the work, not just in the choice of Latin, but in the way in which he writes.
I'd love to dive into the specifics of this book. We will in just a minute, but before we get there, Chad, I'd love if you could speak about some of Arrowsmith's contributions to the Assembly, as well as, he preached before the Assembly twice, I believe, but then he also left early. You already mentioned he was a huge figure in the Assembly, and particularly in the construction of the Confession of Faith. How would you characterize Arrowsmith's involvement? What might you say about his significance?
Yeah, he didn't speak often in the Assembly, but when they were choosing someone to head one of the most important committees, or to play a major part on it, Arrowsmith quickly became an essential figure. When they're at a key point and they need someone to preach to them, helping them to be encouraged or better behaved, they turn to Arrowsmith. When they need something translated to be sent overseas to other churches, Arrowsmith. So he's just a highly respected figure. I think I know where he sat in the Westminster Assembly. This is my guess. When the scribe is doing kind of a roll call vote, I think he turns over his right shoulder first and starts at the top and works his way down the bleachers. And then I've got this theory. It's in the minutes and papers of the Assembly, or my doctoral thesis. I forget which one. His name is usually the first one called. And so I think he's sitting in the top corner of the room. And I think that makes sense in part because he lost an eye. The guy's name is Arrowsmith. He had an eye put out by an arrow. Who knows how exactly that happened? I think it was a childhood accident. And so I'm guessing it's his right eye. He's up in the top right corner of the room. You're going to leave your good eye facing the room, your bad eye facing the wall. He had a glass eye, which is really rare at the time. So it was a pretty new technology. So there we go.
Where's that relic, Chad? Do you have that?
Yeah, no, don't have that relic. Yeah, that's I think that'd be pretty gross. A 17th century glass. I think it's Venice that made them. Anyway, that's really not helping anyone understand the Westminster Assembly. But he'd be a guy in his 40s, the prime of life, recovering from the bereavement of a loss of a wife, having recently married a new one. Just a busy pastor, faithful theologian. On a day-to-day basis, he doesn't stand out. It's when something important is needed that Arrowsmith gets called on.
Love it. Just like Mr. Reliable and trustworthy. really significant figure. Why did he leave the assembly early?
So he was surprised one day to find out he had been appointed the master of St. John's College. At that point, he is given an excuse to spend a lot of his time in Cambridge, but he doesn't leave the assembly during those years. He's just part-time. Eventually, after the king is beheaded in January 1649, and the remnant of the House of Commons, after a political coup, says that anyone who's in a public position must accept a nation without a king and without a House of Lords. This is a real political revolution. Anyone who's in a position of power in the state or so on has to accept this. Most of the Westminster divines leave. Remember, they are in the employ of Parliament. They are clearly sort of the representatives of the state in a way, as a temporary theological body that just kept on running. So that they're very prominent figures, and so they and most of the Presbyterians left in the winter.
Right. So this isn't typically, highly unusual that Arrowsmith did this. Right.
No, he couldn't take it was called the engagement, this declaration that you need to accept a government without a king and House of Lords, and he had fought the war. He had been in favor of the war in order to force Charles to govern responsibly, not to kill the king.
Mm-hmm. So this volume that we have has not only this lengthy, and I don't mean that, I mean that as a good thing. There's a very thorough, wonderful biography, this introduction to Arrowsmith that Chad has written. That lead.
Some would call that indulgent.
It's not indulgent. It's interesting. It's good. And some would say you've done an excellent job, because you'd think, well, maybe you could just write an entire book on it. But I love it. It's just 72 pages. It's just a great length. So it's thorough, but it also doesn't need to be its own thing.
Camden, one of the reasons why it's thorough is because David had a student who became our assistant. And Adrienne Ora asked me, what do we know about his family? I said, historians have said we know nothing about his family. And she just said really politely, are you sure? And so I thought, well, I mean, the last definitive biographical essay says nothing about his family. Let me do some digging. And so I found a will. Then I started finding, it's not rocket science, it's kind of basic historical work given the technology we have today, but I was able to basically piece together his whole family, when he's getting married, who's dying, how he treats his family, what property he has. And as I got into that, then trying to weave his life story into the intellectual biography, which was at first very much focused on his writings, became much more doable. So there was a young, thoughtful assistant now doing her PhD at Catholic University. Is that right, David?
Well, she just finished a master's there in medieval studies.
The CUA
in
DC.
Yeah.
I just found my student ID from that institution. I took one of my externals there. But
yeah.
Crazy.
So lots owing to her. It's the second time an assistant has pushed me for answers. And
those are the kinds of assistants you want, right? And not only that you're helping and trying to develop into scholars in their own right, but people that also motivate you and push you further. Like that's what you want. You want that motivation rather than just yes men or women or glorified clerks or something like that. It's good to have motivated, helpful, and respectful assistants, but people that are doing that kind of work. I love to hear that. Tell me about some of the portions of this book, because we have in this new volume printed here by RHB, we do have this biological introduction. But then when we get into plans for Holy War, we have a dedication. But then we've got this section, these 3 speeches against Weigelianism. I'm wondering if you brothers might be able to introduce us to what that is, and also why those are included here in this particular printing.
Well, if I could make two quick comments about
Please.
it, and then Chad can give the substance. And that is first, they're really interesting oratorical speeches, which I had a lot of fun translating because they're different in style than the prose essay of the Tactica Sacra. And secondly, we decided at the very last minute almost to do this. So it was an additional 30 pages, and my initial response was, oh no, another 30 pages. But I thoroughly enjoyed it because here he is he's speaking in a high rhetorical vein, so it's more like Renaissance Latin, and was therefore a lot of fun to work on.
Yes. After David translated them, and I read them and reread them, I began to think that this is one of the better decisions David and I have ever made together. This is I think these essays, quirky as they appear, are perhaps the key to the book. Valentin Weigel is a late 16th century figure, a German Lutheran pietist pastor of no real distinction. Sometime after he dies, maybe a couple of decades or so, people begin to find manuscripts, books that he's written, and they bring them into print. And so a 16th century figure becomes a 17th century controversy.
Mm-hmm.
He's a mystic, like Meister Eckhart and Tauler and others. He venerates Schwenkfeld. I never say his name well, but Schwenkfeld.
Schwenkfeld, yeah.
Yeah, and he holds to a bunch of a confessional person would say a bunch of heretical views. He's an enthusiast, which we all know is very bad to have enthusiasm. And
equivocating, you're equivocating.
Yes. So he believes in direct inspirations from the Holy Spirit, which is kind of what's going on with enthusiasm. He also does not believe that the magistrate has any responsibility to enforce or encourage theological orthodoxy in the church. For John Arrowsmith, like other divines who believe in an established church, that's a problem. And so he's writing against the Weigelians because the writings are kind of coming into print. George Gillespie might be the first person who writes against them in English. He's writing against them in part, I think, maybe as a cipher. I think he's worried that Cromwell is also going to do a poor job of encouraging orthodoxy in the church. Rather than writing against Cromwell, not wise, maybe better to write against someone else saying the same things. I think these essays help to explain why he wanted to write Plans on Holy War. They kind of hold an interpretive key. Arguably, someone else might disagree, but that's the direction I take this in the introduction.
So let's talk about this particular book, The Plans for Holy War. Of course, that a Latin title to begin with. This is not the original title. It was Tactica Sacra, which is definitely a faithful translation, but tactica you can understand. Tactical. This is military type of material and subject matter. But he's speaking about spiritual warfare. We're not. This isn't a book of Christian nationalism. That Chad and David have decided to get on board and take it to the house. No, we're speaking about spiritual warfare, but I'm curious how this book is distinguished from other books that might be categorized in the same vein. Think of William Gurnall's his book on Ephesians 6 on spiritual warfare, The Armor of God. How is this book by Arrowsmith, maybe within its context, so certainly it's going to have a lot in common with other books of the time, but how is this unique, distinguished, and really, as I believe one of you mentioned in the volume, it truly is a gem. Why is that the case?
David?
Well, I can't speak to Gurnall, but I'll say a couple of other things. Tactica Sacra, right, could be translated as sacred strategies. And that was the original working title that we gave it. But Chad and I have a long running dispute about the value of alliteration. He's more fond of it than I am. I think that there are other kinds of figures of speech, more than 40, like hippolage, epiplexis, and zeugma. And so I'd like to mix things up a little bit. And pretty late in the game, one of us, I can't honestly remember who, suggested, how about we call it Plans for Holy War? Because not only is it more catchy, I think, it's a more accurate description of the contents. And so, again, not speaking to Gurnall, but it's an extended meditation on the proto-evangelium of Genesis 3:15, and then traces that theme through virtually every biblical occurrence of holy warfare as the Christian is engaged in conflict against, the threefold enemies, the devil, the world, and the flesh. And I think it's the mix of intellectual firepower and real pious fervor that makes it so interesting. He never compromises either, I would say. And I learned a lot of theology from it in terms of different views of justification as he interacts with Gattaker and Gomar and many others, things I had never heard of, though I've studied theology in an amateur fashion for a long time. But just when it starts to become very dense, he will interrupt the flow with some really nice quote from Luther, Olevianus, or some classical author, and it's a really brilliant way to write a book. Sorry.
He's really playful in the quotes sometimes too. Sometimes after he's like, now why would he say something like this? Or he just throws these remarks in once in a while to kind of break it up.
Yeah, I was just interjecting to say, or sometimes he'll throw in a story.
Right. A good story about the appearance of a demon in Norwich or something like that. Just something very unusual but attention grabbing.
Yeah, and he has a light touch, so you're left thinking, does he really believe this?
Right.
Or is he amused by this? I think he's often amused. So just in line with what David said, he's writing this as a sustained argument that Satan's principal damage, the principal damage that Satan wants to do is to teach falsehood, is to lie to us. Therefore, all spiritual warfare needs to be understood principally as theological warfare. And so we need to take error seriously. We need to take theology seriously. This is what Satan most wants us to get wrong. William Gurnall, writing 2 years before, is more focused on personal piety and temptation, the wide varieties of temptations that we face as Christians. Interestingly, Arrowsmith begins in book 1 with the Proto-Evangelion. He ends with an exposition of Ephesians 6 that's consistent with his understanding of the sort of the essential nature of our warfare that has to do with truth and good theology.
He's really kind of presenting a whole biblical theology, a redemptive historical context to Ephesians 6, and then expositing it there, rather than just looking at Paul's writings in Ephesians 6 and treating them as if they're self-contained, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, David, wouldn't you say that the book is, in a sense, a biblical theology of warfare?
Sure.
Definitely.
Very theological biblical theology. Yet, he manages to weave in all of our, confessional loci narrative, but it's all, one way or another, he keeps coming back to this theme of spiritual warfare.
Which is very significant, just an immensely important covenantal theme. Klein has been very good, but Arrowsmith's definitely building. I mean, Klein in this sense is maybe echoing some of Arrowsmith's points to speak about those two lines that we have right in Genesis. It sets the stage for the whole story and the narrative of the conflict throughout the Bible between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And that plays out in a variety of ways. And we see that even presently as the church battles against the forces of evil. And we have the Holy Spirit to help us and advance us in those regards. What types of does Arrowsmith get? And I'm sure listeners are going to want to know if it remains at the more theological or even theoretical level, or is in more stereotypical Puritan fashion. Are there practical matters? How does Arrowsmith develop or really seek to apply the theology to the lives of those who might read his book? He's still very pastoral. So this is a, pastoral scholastic writing, right?
Yes.
I think. And so how does that come through in this particular book?
I'll just make one comment, if that's all right. And that is that the scholastico pastoralis style, whereby he divides ideas, carefully lays them out by their genre and species, really is a strength of the work organizationally. But then you can see his pastoral concerns, I would say specifically in matters of prayer. So he spends a lot of time expositing the Lord's Prayer, how to pray at various times in one's life. And some of the most moving portions are where he is describing how great men prayed near the time of their death. So Bernard of Clairvaux talking to his brother, various reformers. I don't know if it was Ursinus or Musculus. There's a very moving passage where he describes one of these earlier reformers on his deathbed and how the man was entirely devoted to prayer. So for me, those were the portions of the work that I found the most encouraging.
Mm.
Yeah, I was going to go to the same places in the work for the same reasons, but I would say his polemic is very cheerful and very, very powerful. He's one of the most cheerful polemicists that I've read. And his constant polemic is that we need to care more about what God's word teaches. We need to invest more deeply in theological study. It lacks the occasionally the sort of the grumpy rebuke that can characterize the writings of some Puritans or some who imitate them. He manages to pull off this message of man up, read your Bible, care about theology, nothing matters more, without sort of constantly chastising the reader. You leave a chapter thinking, I think he just really challenged me there, and I'm not feeling too bad about it right now. And I think it's a kind of remarkable gift. In his own day, he was known as being sort of one of the most pleasant people and good-humored people that anyone had ever met. Even people who really fell out with him and disagreed with him on substantive key theological issues would acknowledge that he was one of those gracious people they had ever met. Wow. That comes through in the book. Mm. So if you know someone who doesn't like Puritans, have them read Arrowsmith, and they'll come away saying, "Well, okay, here we've got a win here." Sure. There's probably.
Along those lines, how might this book change a reader's understanding of spiritual warfare compared to perhaps modern writings on the topic? What are some of the value of reading a book that's 350 years old to get people out of whatever the current tropes might be or packaging of books and ideas that we have in the present day?
So I think looking at length, lingering, but not too unpleasantly over the work of Satan, his minions, the many ways in which he's attempted to deceive people, the way in which people in the Bible have responded to this. I came away after each read with a confidence in Christ, my captain. There's a very persistent, Christ-honoring gospel focus to this work that, again, is not always present in books on spiritual warfare, which are sometimes saying, pull up your bootstraps, or inducing paranoia, or suggesting really kind of quirky ways of dealing with temptation. He's very thoughtful, very sane and helpful. And I was left encouraged after each read.
What was your experience, David, when, as not only you reading this but also translating it? It's like an order of magnitude greater involvement in the text. How were you affected as you were working through this book?
Well, I want to just echo everything that Chad said, and I may be revealing my own prejudices more than Arrowsmith's thoughts in saying this, but I was very impressed with his uncompromising attitude toward the truth. So this was written for a learned audience. That's why it was written in Latin, so it could be read throughout the continent and really anywhere. And for all of the warm and really loving expressions that Arrowsmith has, he never retreats from the notion that if we're going to be useful to the Lord and one another, we must develop our minds rigorously. So he does that, and he talks about, for example, the causes for the heterodoxy that are raging throughout our beloved England, or words to that effect. And he says the reason that there is heterodoxy is because people are not reading their scriptures. They have abandoned the biblical languages. They think that to know history isn't adequate or necessary, and what you really need is a greater kind of enthusiasm. I was reading recently Letters from the Front, which Machen, World War I think Barry Wow, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. And right near the end of it, there's a reference to Machen having a disagreement with Stevenson, who also was in France at the time, president of Princeton. And Stevenson wanted to weaken the curriculum, words to this effect, by diminishing the emphasis on biblical languages and introducing more courses in English Bible and practical theology. And this made Machen, it's on page 316, this made Machen very upset. And so in some ways, it's really disheartening to learn that this is a perennial problem. It was a problem in the 17th century, it was a problem in 1918, and apparently it's a problem today. So if you want to have your motivation for hard work in order to serve God's kingdom, you want to have that fortified, you should read Arrowsmith, I think.
Hamden, if I may.
Please.
David's done two really helpful things for the book, in addition to, agreeing that we ought to translate these Weigelian lectures, anti-Weigelian lectures. He mentioned at one point, hoping to, that this is presented in, he modestly said, hopefully this is in presentable English or readable English. Those who have previewed the book so far have described his translation as monumental. They've referred to it as a soaring rendering, faithful, finely nuanced. This is a great translation.
Yeah, it is great.
Really fantastic.
Well done, brother.
And I can't speak highly enough about just how readable this is, and the work that David put into this over a long period of time. The other thing is he saved the introduction from a really grumpy conclusion, which I think I can share on Reformed Forum, but wouldn't have been appropriate for the book. We're reading Arrowsmith as we're watching the decline of the quality of education in so many institutions that we love, and just the dumbing down, the simplification, the instant practical application rather than the hard work that trains people to kind of do that themselves. And I had this sort of 3 or 4 page riff on the decline of college and seminary education and so on. David's like, yeah, I don't disagree with any of that, but that's that's not what the introduction will need for every
Right.
But
That's the editor's cut.
that was the translator's cut to the editor's.
That's what you put on your the audio commentary, right, for later, for the box set.
Yeah, but when you read Arrowsmith, you will surely reflect on the state of college and seminary education today, and think, wow, this is a call to go higher and to go deeper. And I think both of us were really impacted by that.
For sure.
So, and that was when we gave it to the publisher some years ago. There was a bit of a backlog. I noticed that I have a note saying that I couldn't look something up because of the current pandemic. It was a little while between submission and publication. So, but there we go.
Well, we appreciate it. Are there any other final remarks or anything we missed, maybe that you want to let potential readers know? I'm encouraging everyone to get a copy of the book, but what are some things that we ought to highlight before wrapping up?
It's not rocket science, Camden, but there is a very good index at the back. And for those people wanting to write a theological paper and to know what a Westminster divine thought about a particular topic, I mean, we want to commend the idea of reading through books rather than just plundering them. But if you want to plunder the Puritans, it's easy to do with this volume, both with the Scripture Index and the Subject Index. And the other thing to say is, in relation to indexes, is that Scripture indexes for the early modern period are subject indexes. That is to say, typical passages, or a particular passage tends to yield particular themes. And so if you're looking for information on what someone thinks about assurance, you go to the classic assurance passage, and that becomes your subject index. So great subject index. The Scripture Index yields even more. I do hope that people who have only limited time will jump right into the book. If you really feel like you don't have time to read the introduction, it is indulgently long. Even if I had fun with it, jump into the book and be edified. You read a few pages a day. It'd be surprising how quickly you can read through the book.
Mm-hmm. David, any other remarks?
Yes, four very quick comments. The first is, I'm grateful for Chad's kind remarks, and I am pleased with the work. I had a lot of help from various individuals to make it better, including Chad, many rereads. Second, for those who are familiar with the Westminster Standards, and you read through the whole work, at various places you will definitely hear echoes of him referring to specific lines in those documents, no doubt because of his contribution, his friendship with Anthony Tuckney, whom I understand was primarily responsible for the larger catechism, portions of the work on the law. So that's quite remarkable. The third thing is the eponychia. So make sure you read the eponychia, which is the victory hymns of the apostles. That's in book 3. And that's very stirring and it's very stirring and encouraging reading. So the whole thing ends in victory with Christ as our captain. And then I guess the final point is that it ends on a bit of a blue note, and that is he quotes from George Buchanan, a Scottish poet, and it's Buchanan's rendition of one of the Psalms. I can't remember which one, but it wasn't the greatest way to end, I don't think, just because the poetry is a little bit clunky. Hopefully this will motivate people to read right to the end and see what Arrowsmith did with Buchanan at the end.
I love it.
But the overall thrust is a very heavenly one. So yes, the final few lines are a bit blue, but for someone who thinks that theology is not well done unless it's got eschatology, this is the best book for you. Amen. It's eschatology from beginning to end.
We love it. Plans for Holy War. Tactica Sacra, now newly translated in English beautifully and excellently by one of our guests today, David Noe, and got a great introduction to Arrowsmith, and as well as editorial assistance and work by our other guest, Chad Van Dixhoorn. Brothers, it's always a pleasure to speak with you both. Thanks so much for taking the time to work on this volume. I hope that you find it rewarding, and know your reward is in heaven, but I do want to thank you on behalf of all the people that have read and will read this book for your work, and thank you also for the time speaking with me today. We really appreciate it.
So that was like the perfect wind down speech, and then I thought of something else.
Go ahead. Let's do it.
So this is a shameless plug for what David and I are doing now, which is working on Samuel Rutherford.
Oh, yeah.
We've got the first volume coming out, the Lord willing, later this year. This is the first of 21 volumes, the complete works of Rutherford. David's the leading translator. He's doing the first sort of volume and a half. And then Joseph Tipton and David are translating probably about equally in the work as a whole. Everything in Latin will be in English. Everything in manuscript will be printed. It's just a really exciting work. And there, as here, David and I and others want to give a shout out to our just different assistants. I mentioned one assistant, but we've had people helping to hunt down citations, check scriptural references. I mean, David and I really don't want the credit for the whole volume, if you will, given we've had so much help. And so I'm looking forward to you receiving an advanced copy of the first couple of volumes. We're going to do the first 2 volumes at once by Rutherford. The one is Rutherford explaining how on every loci of doctrine, Arminians are wrong and the Reformed are right. And then the next one is a full treatise on Scripture. So that was a shameless plug.
No, that's good. We'll queue it up for a future episode.
A careful review of Arminianism is the title of the first volume and a half, the Examen Arminianismi. And again, I learned a tremendous amount in the work of translating it. Like many, here's more of the shameless plug. I believe that the problem with Arminianism was primarily soteriological, right? And issues with the will. And while that's true, the 17th century version of Arminianism, at least, had arguably greater problems with doctrine of God, Christology, and virtually everything else.
Yeah.
Goodness. I can't wait to take a look at that. Keep me in the loop. I'd love to see things when it's ready to be shown to people like me. And we can certainly talk about that in the future. I can't wait. You guys are putting too many things on my shelf. I can't keep up, but I'm thankful for it. And thankful for your time today. I'll put links to all of the appropriate places in our episode description. But again, we've been speaking about John Arrowsmith's Plans for Holy War, translated by David Noe, edited and introduced by Chad Van Dixhoorn, published by Reformation Heritage Books in the Westminster Assembly Project series. It's been a joy. Thank you very much, brothers. We appreciate speaking with you today.
Thank you, Camden.
Thank you, Camden.
You got it. Take a look at our website, reformedforum.org, for information on all of our programs, courses. We have lots of free video courses available on our website and on YouTube. A new course on the life of Abraham. We've got a new course on Calvinistic Trinitarian theology by Lane Tipton that should be out by now. We have Carlton Wynn's course on books 1 and 2 of Calvin's Institutes, which has been doing really well. It's a tremendous work that's suitable for Sunday school. We do all sorts of stuff, and it's all available for free. And check out the events page. Again, we have an upcoming webinar with Dr. Tipton on the immutable person of the Son, particularly looking at Hebrews, and our annual theology conference, September 28th, 2024, here in the Chicagoland area. I do want to thank everybody for listening, and we hope you join us again next time on Christ the Center.